Sorry. All right, everybody, we're going to get started. So if you're in the back, good luck finding a seat. I think we do have some. Do we have any seats over here in the back? Yeah, so if you're walking in, no, on this back right-hand side, or I guess your back left-hand side, there are a few other chairs. My name is Ben. Thank you so much for coming to the New York launch of Abolish Rent. We have an incredible panel here today. Both of the authors of this remarkable book, Tracy and Leonardo, have joined us. Leo flying out from LA. We're also joined by Khadijah Haynes, who is an incredible tenant leader, a remarkable figure in the tenant movement here in New York. Really glad she can join us. I just wanted to say, this is one of, in my opinion, I was the editor of this book, but I believe that it really was one of the most important books published in the last few years. I know that sounds like quite a claim, but I think you'll find that claim is vindicated by the end of this kind of discussion tonight. The book does two really important things that I think you won't find anywhere else. The first is that it does provide a kind of clear, uncompromising socialist account of housing, tenancy, gentrification, and what the authors call the centuries-long war on tenants. This is an issue that has moved from the margins of politics, the sideshows of the rent is too damn high party, to one of the most animated and central parts of the presidential election. One where Democrats, you might have seen at the debate last night, Democrats were calling for greater subsidies for developers and capitalists, and where Republicans were quite literally calling for a lethal mass deportation campaign to slacken the demand on housing supply. At a time when people are coming to narrate their own immiseration and exploitation in the language of the housing crisis, this book provides a really concrete and powerful analysis, one that is historically grounded, informed by a critique of America's political economy, of capitalist property relations, of landlordism, and how they are the problem. In turn, they put tenants and our struggles back at the heart of how we think about the ruling blocks that govern American politics at the municipal and national level. They give us the tools we need to rethink the possibility of working class political power in this country. More importantly, Tracy and Leo have written a book about this remarkable movement that is truly nationwide, but almost never covered in national media. A story of poor and working class people, of immigrants and their white-collar neighbors, banding together to fight and win positive changes in their lives. In the language of C.L.R. James, it records and reflects this incredible strategic and organizational innovation in working class life. This book is organized around the insights of tenants in struggle, their stories, their analysis, their practice. And these tenants that you have most often been organizing with, in these cases of these authors, rather intensely. The result is a text that is so much richer and more textured, it's almost journalistic, than any manifesto that I've read. It is many-voiced, and that alone, getting at this chorus of badass leaders who are the seeds of another future in our cities, the germ of a new way of living that is otherwise muted in coverage of YIMBYs and NIMBYs and all the rest, is something really significant. So I'm really glad we can gather here today to be the first of what I think is going to be many discussions in the New York City area about the ideas that populate this book. Let me say a few words about our panelists. So Tracy is the co-founder of the LA Tenant Union, a frequent contributor to New Republic, and the author with Leo, obviously, of Abolish Rent. They are currently on rent strike in New York City, so give them a round of applause for that. Leonardo has been organizing tenants in Boyle Heights for more than 30 years. He's trained in liberation theology. He co-founded Union de Vecinos in 1996 and the LA Tenant Union in 2015. Let's give a round of applause to that too. Come on. We're gonna need more engagement tonight, folks. Khadijah is an organizer with Brooklyn Eviction Defense and Right to Counsel Coalition, and she's a founder of Black Women for Theory and Practice. Round of applause. We're gonna have a kind of portion where we're discussing the book on stage, first with our authors. We'll bring Khadijah in the second half of our discussion, and then we'll finally kick it out to you guys so that we can hopefully have a really engaged back and forth about some of the strategic and political dilemmas facing the movement. And that's something everyone has some insights they can weigh in on, whether they're new to the movement or a more veteran kind of organizer. So for this first question is for both Tracy and Leo. So this book is so obviously an effort to kind of organize the accumulated wisdom and intelligence of the tenant movement up until this point in its development. But we should start by saying a little about what the tenant movement is, and in particular, what the Los Angeles Tenant Union is, how it started, where it's going, and more generally, why it takes the form of a tenant union at all.
Hi. So first, I just want to say, before I answer this question, thank you all so much for coming, and I'm really especially grateful to hold space with you all amidst this escalation of Israel's genocide. But as we saw last night, and as we've seen for this entire year, the resistance to that genocide is steadfast and unflinching. And until Palestine is free, it is our task to support that resistance by and which means, I think, reflecting on our power here. So just to note that underwriting what we talk about here tonight is that broader project that is connected to everything we do. How do we build the lasting organizations and institutions that we need to exercise real power and real leverage over our lives and over the state, which is now set on this war? I don't have the answers to that question, but I do feel strongly that internationalism is already at issue within the question of housing, and we've seen the growing overlap of the population of immigrants and the homeless, and the overlap between the fascist backlash against them. And as Ben said, last night we just saw a vice presidential candidate who suggested that mass deportation would be a strategy to bring housing costs down. So shame, exactly. So just to now answer your question, thank you, Ben. So for me, right, the LA Tenant Union was an answer to two questions. How could we fight back against the displacement of working class and poor people across our city? And how could we make tenants themselves the center of that process? Most often, right, tenants are treated as victims of our housing system. They're treated as clients of social services or of lawyers who help them, or as passive constituents, right, who register their opinions once every 4 years with a vote. So how could we think of tenants as political subjects capable of changing the balance of power in our cities and with our landlords, and ultimately for the project of remaking the world? And I should say too, right, that like we didn't start the process knowing that we were going to form a union. One of the first things we did together as a group was hold a renters' rights workshop, right? And then over time, we sort of learned fairly quickly that like all three parts of that framework had to go. Like renters, because the people who pay rent aren't the only people who stand outside of the capitalist housing system that extracts from us and organizes our cities, right? People who live outside, people who live in care homes, anyone who doesn't control their own housing is a tenant that can be part of this movement. Rights, because we know the rights we have are often like really incredibly complicated to use, and they're so difficult to enforce. And the right that we really want, right, like the human right to housing, well, that would take another type of world to get. And then workshop, obviously, because like we couldn't just give people something and then send them on our way, right? We needed to build a lasting organization, something that could respond to the organization of landlords, real estate speculators, politicians, and police. And so we asked ourselves, what is the kind of organization we need? And a union, right, that for us is that vehicle. If a tenant is anyone who doesn't control their own housing, then a tenant union is the vehicle that we're making to bring us collective control over the places where we live. And just a note too on the, to think about in this time, right, when capital itself is reorganizing around speculation and the reordering of place, 65% of the world's wealth is held in real estate, and 75% of that is in housing. So what is the really revolutionary potential of a tenant movement to break down and redistribute that hoard of wealth that is stored in the places where we live?
Yeah. So I guess to the story of the Tenants Union. My local that I organize in the Unión de Vecinos, East Side local of the LA Tenants Union, started like 30 years before the work of the Tenants Union. And It got started, as Ben was saying, with the demolition of the housing projects in Los Angeles. It was 1,100 units of housing, the largest housing project in west of the Mississippi, where basically 1,100 families were being pushed out because they were going to improve the community and do better housing for them. But the reality is that people didn't realize that 2/3 of the people were going to be pushed out. And we were part of a nonprofit organization, part of a church that had been doing a lot of work in the community for a long, long time, dealing with the violence of the gangs, dealing with the violence of the police, dealing with racist immigration rights. And little by little, through the work of the church, we have been able to build a community of communities that were organizing themselves to defend themselves from the raids and to defend themselves from the police and to develop relationship with the gang members. This was a community that, rather than calling the police to bring the gang members and put them in jail, was organizing barbecues for gang members to get to know them. And in the process of getting to know the gang members, they were developing relationships with them, and they were developing their own sense of authority as adults in the community. So little, by 1996, when the federal government decides to demolish public housing, the women who lived in that community were negotiating peace truce, they were disarming the gang members, they were intervening when the police would come to beat them up. So they had developed their own mechanisms, their own tools to deal with the violence in the community. And in that process, they developed a very strong community in a territory that was theirs now. And here is the government and the city says, well, this is going to be better for you. We're going to demolish the homes, we're going to build something new, and then you're going to have a choice to live wherever you want to. As we talk to the community started saying, well, we're not convinced of this thing. And we're not so sure that this is what we want. We like where we are. Maybe we would like better housing and more modernized, but we like where we are. We like this thing. The government, the nonprofits, the church, and everybody and their grandmother said, no, this is good for you. You should go for it. But the community wasn't sure, so at some point during this debate and this discussion, the community decided to stay in the projects and fight for their own homes. Well, needless to say, some of us got fired from the nonprofit, and the community had to decide what they were going to do and whether they would rather go to mass and save their homes. And one of the women who was the leader in the community says, fuck the church, we're going to fight for our homes. And we'll go to mass to pray, but really our homes is going to be on the street. So that's how the Unión de Vecinos was created. And we spent between 5 and 10 years fighting for people to stay in their homes. The church drove a wedge within the community, the nonprofits drove a wedge within the community, politicians drove a wedge within the community, and the people who decided to stay within the organization to fight for their homes are the people who stayed in the housing projects. They're the people who got a contract that signed and they said, you get to stay here, you get to choose that you want, and you get to choose to evaluate that house if it's in good condition so you can do this stuff. So we got a contract as a union negotiated by the tenants themselves that were resisting the demolition. As we started working with the people who left the housing projects, we started going into the neighborhoods, we started realizing that the conditions of housing were horrible. And we started joining the campaigns for affordable housing. And we started supporting all the nonprofits who were saying, oh, the solution to this is affordable housing. But the reality is that the people who were fighting for the housing would not qualify for that housing. The nonprofits that were supporting this stuff were not telling these people that they were not going to qualify for that housing. So we learned that affordable housing wasn't for the most poor and for the people who really needed the housing. So we went to the lawyers and said, well, we need to have more policies to do these things. And the lawyers would say, well, what we need is more housing and more housing. But the reality is that foundations and unions and nonprofits were saying development is the solution to this problem, and people have to organize to have more development, more housing, and more demolition of the housing projects. So for us, it was very, very important to understand that we didn't have a movement of tenants. Everybody else was working with the tenants to get what they wanted, but nobody was working with the tenants to get what the tenants wanted. So we needed to have something that was centered on the tenants. So Unión de Vecinos members and us, we started talking to foundations, and the foundations were saying, well, we don't have the capacity, we need to do research. And years passed before anything happened. At the same time, members of Unión de Vecinos were part of a group of artists that were dealing with the neoliberal crisis and doing all sorts of research and presentations. We went to Spain, to Ireland, all sorts of places to do arts on gentrification. And it was really, really cool, but nothing was changing, And so the group of artists called Ultra Red, we got together and said, well, this is not working out. What we wanted to do, we developed relationships with other people. We learned a lot about neoliberalism in different parts of the world, but really nothing was changing in a way that we wanted to change. So we decided to start what we call the School of Echoes, which is what Tracy was talking about. In our communities, we started inviting activists, organizers, leaders in the community, and anybody who wanted to come and had meetings with us and dinners with us. We did it in galleries, we did it in alleys, wherever we wanted. People would come together and say, well, Unión de Vecinos, Ultra Red, we're trying to start this process of listening. And the whole idea is for people who would come to these meetings to go to their neighborhoods, wherever they lived, and listen to what was happening. We started with the whole question of what are you hearing in your neighborhood? And yes, gentrification was coming to LA in a very aggressive way, and people were being displaced from Echo Park, from all these neighborhoods in Los Angeles that maybe some of you know, not all of you know, but gentrification was the thing. And the issue was, well, how are you going to defend people from gentrification? It is tenants who are being pushed firstly. And again, we came back to the question of who has to lead this thing? And obviously the answer was the tenants. So we started having all these conversations. And after having all these hearings, a collective was created that was saying, we really need to take action on these things. They got involved in the defense of youth in Echo Park because there were all these laws that were criminalizing the youth and the gang members. There was all this conversation about people in Section 8 and who were losing their vouchers, who were pushed out of their housing. So basically, a group of us got together and said, well, what we need is a union of tenants. Unión de Vecinos have been working on that. The people themselves were saying this stuff. And here we go again, people are asking the question of capacity and all stuff. We're going crazy, and I'm just going bonkers because here we are, we're going to start the conversation again, what do we need for tenants? And crazy Tracy decides to say, well, a union has members, and to have a member, you have to pay your fee, so here's my $5, and we had member 001 of the Tenants Union, which we basically launched us to do this whole process. Weeks later, and thanks to this process, we started organizing campaigns in the different buildings that nobody thought that we could save. Section 8 people who were being pushed out because the law says so were resisting. People in their homes that were being criminalized by the landlords, and they were terrified. When they realized that they were part of a union that was going to fight with them, they decided to do this stuff. In Boyle Heights, people who were being pushed out of their housing illegally decided to fight. And that's how the Tenants Union was formed, by basically saying the center of the struggle has to be in the tenants. The crisis is not housing, the crisis is tenants who are not fighting for their housing. And that's how we got started.
Fantastic. Tracy, I want to ask you a question in particular. So, we've been talking about renters. They've long been an absent category, a missing category in American political discourse. Now it appears entirely mainstream to talk about tenancy, about rent, and about housing at all levels of government. So at a time when this discourse is so ubiquitous, you wrote a book that sort of reframes the question about housing policy. Mm-hmm. I want you to talk a little bit more about the central ideological intervention of your book. What do you want to change about how we talk and think about the housing crisis?
Yeah, thank you. I think that our contention, right, it comes from the insight and the experience of poor and working class people, right? For whom the housing crisis is permanent and has always been permanent. We, in our housing system, the average landlord works, does anyone know how many months? This is gonna be fun. How many hours does a landlord work in a month? 3. Okay, it's 4, so really close. Really, really close. 4 hours a month, right? And it takes 4 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford the average 2-bedroom rent. And so this is what, our intervention is that this is the crisis, right? And people already know this, that tenants are starving. They're giving up medication, they're overcrowding, they're moving to the outskirts and commuting hours a day just to be able to afford a basic human need. And that itself is the crisis. Tenants are the one who are in crisis. And so we started from this idea of, our housing system obviously doesn't allocate the best quality housing to the most people, right? Like if the purpose of a system is what it does, what does our housing system do? Our housing system enriches, it brings trillions of dollars into the hands of landlords and real estate speculators, and it ejects people into the streets, right? Our housing system is an unhousing system. That is how it works. And so, we I think it's really clear that like rent itself, this power relationship, that this monthly tribute that we have to fork over to people already richer than us to pay for our human need for a home, right? Like that itself is the crisis. The clapping is sweet. But, and so, and why do we have to do it, right? Well, we pay rent at the peril of our need and at the barrel of a gun, right? Like, we pay rent because we desperately need it, but also because the agents of state violence will be called on us if we can't pay it, right? We have both the threat of eviction. The sheriffs or cops will come to your door and throw you out with physical force if you don't pay rent. And also, you have the threat of incarceration and police violence if you find yourself living outside, because it's effectively illegal to be homeless, right? So we don't just pay rent because we need housing, right? We pay rent because it's literally a crime not to do so. In other words, it is a crime not to be exploited by a landlord. And so I think that this gets into the second part of your question, which is about the role of policy and the state. And I'm gonna drink a sip of water and then go on. And so, when we were thinking about how to frame, the history of housing policy in this country, what we settled on was the war on tenants. And because like the war on crime and the war on drugs, right, our American housing policy is a war against the poor and people of color, right? And we can start all the way back when Black people in this country were finally no longer held as property, and poor white people were recruited into alignment with elite interests by gaining access to stolen indigenous land. And that is a repeated process throughout the history of housing policy in this country, that the benefits accrue to the wealthy, majority white people, and are put into private hands. And we see this in the New Deal when the US government invents the 30-year mortgage and home ownership subsidies, and it determines the value of people's property through segregation and redlining, right? We see this when the GI Bill lures white people to the suburbs and abandons poor and people of color in the cities. And then we see it when those cities are policed and criminalized like internal colonies, which is the Black Panthers' language for what was happening in the 60s. I think that to just jump forward, right now, our housing system, like the forms of housing that our government spends the most money on in this country is private home ownership and prisons, right? We have almost $200 billion in subsidies that go to private home ownership, and we have almost $200 billion in taxes and public debt that go to the public housing of human caging, right? That these are publicly funded homes, they just happen to be cages. And so, that these, I think also, we can see on the debate stage that those two sides of our housing policy were being represented. Republicans, it was mass deportations. Democrats, it was homeownership subsidies and subsidies for developers, right? And so what we see in this history is the desperation to control populations rather than the private housing market. And that is the, that is the ground that our policies sit on. And, we know, obviously, what this means. We have Eric Garcetti, the former mayor of Los Angeles, to thank for, for in a good economy, homelessness goes up, right? That is the consensus that we've settled on in this country, that in a good economy, homelessness goes up. And also that it takes an incredible amount of violence to maintain this system, to turn cities into the rent plantations that they are right now. And that's Mike Davis. That's his phrase. But, you know, just to end this discussion, right, we end this chapter on the war on tenants with thinking about Donald Trump and Breonna Taylor, right? The real estate developer in chief who made his fortune scamming government subsidies, and a black woman who was murdered by Louisville PD for standing in the way of a development scheme. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Leo, I want to ask you a question. You know, I think that a lot of people think tenant unions are centrally, maybe exclusively concerned with issues at the level of the building, disrepair, issues like, you know, broken sinks, creaky floors, and it certainly is often. And the kind of, you know, corollaries that many people think in turn that the movement proceeds exclusively at a building by building level. It proceeds in the ones and twos. You tell a story of tenant unionism in this book that's, you know, the tenant union is a really capacious vehicle for addressing a range of issues of police violence and collective safety, of gender violence, even internationalism. And you put tenants at the heart of the political economy of America's anti-democratic hegemonic bloc. So I want to hear you say a little bit more about why you think tenant unions are such a good organization for the practice of politics for working class people generally. Maybe tell us a story that gives body to this really expansive idea of tenant unionism.
Gulp. No, I mean, as Tracy was talking, I was also thinking of the same, along some of these lines of this question. One of the things that we learned from the shack dwellers in South Africa, I forgot his name, but one of the things that he told us once in a conversation around the tenant rights was that you're a citizen of the place that you live in. And I know that the word citizenship in the United States is very complex to understand all stuff, but for those of us who come from the third world and that part of, we see ourselves with a different kind of struggle, we see ourselves as citizens of the world. The notion of citizenship is about the right to a territory, the right to remain where you are, the right to choose where you live, and the right to determine and to have your self-determination as a community, as people. So the locals of the Tenants Union, the TAs of the Tenants Union, are about self-determination. A tenant exists in a building, and the building is in a block, and the block is in a street, and the street is in a city, and the city is really what this is all about. Tenants are the ones who are building the city. When we're talking about the gig economy, how many people now are working in a factory on a big industry and all stuff? They're in the neighborhoods, they're in the places that they live in. And just to give you an example of what happens, when people learn to fight for their homes, and they start investing in fixing their homes and addressing the issues of their own homes, then they have to look at what's outside of their homes. So one of the corners in our community, and actually this is one of the books, we have, in one place we have a crossing walk where people, at the first stages of the revolution, the first stages of this process, we had women and children that were trying to get their children to go to school through the most direct way that they could have, because to get their children to school to another place, it was very, very long and dangerous, actually. So they wanted to cross the street, and they couldn't. And we went and asked the council member, you know, can you please put a stoplight there or paint the zebra lines? I don't know how they call it in the United States, but they call them zebra lines in Mexico. And the guy's like, well, no, we have to work with the Department of Transportation to figure this out. And the women said, fuck it. They started doing their own cross guards. They just dressed up like the cross guards of the schools and dressing up, and they started stopping traffic. And then at some point, you know, they started getting more support and momentum, and then all of a sudden we organized 100 people to cross the street at once, and then we would stop the traffic. And then sometimes they would stop the traffic and put big signs on the road saying, don't cross. And to finally the council member said, what the hell are you guys doing? The police is complaining to me that this is going on. And we said, well, you know, we've been asking for this stop, like you haven't done it, what are we gonna do? But the guy was so upset with this thing that he decided to start working with the transportation department. They said, oh, we need to do all these studies and so on and so forth. So it came to a point where one of his staff members one day said, okay, the study of crossing is going to be on such and such a day. They're looking for X number of people to cross the street. You better do this because the council member doesn't want to have this problem anymore. So of course, we organized one day of people to cross the street as many times as they could to stop. So we had our stoplight. In another situation, we had senior citizens right across the corner from this place. There's this bus stop. And you know, senior citizens sit there and standing there for the bus, and there's a lot of sun, and it's tiring, and it's up at the top of a hill. So the youth and the women who now are working together because of all the work that we've done with gangs, they decided to do guerrilla architecture, and we put benches there for people to sit there. And one of our mottos there is, más vale pedir perdón que pedir permiso. It's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. So they put their bench there, and the bench there has been there for the last 12 years. Nobody has removed it or anything. Right behind there, there's an alley where someone got beaten up long time ago, and the community started cleaning up this alley and saying, well, they were blaming the neighbors, they were blaming everybody, but the community that was there said, no, well, let's clean it up ourselves and show that we care. And little by little, over time of cleaning it up, they started saying, well, this is also a good place for us to have meetings. And then after that, in a summer where it was very hot and boring and stuff like that, they start showing movies in that alley. And the gang members come and say, hey, fuck you, this is our territory, we want you to get out of here. And the women say, oh, we're just gonna show a movie, can you just give us a break? The women show their movie, and little by little start realizing that the gang members start sitting right next to the kids watching the movie. The following week, the gang members are protecting the alley so cars don't come in to do this stuff. The women basically became a municipal power within that corner that controls traffic, that does urban amenities, and that now manages the violence that exists in the neighborhood. So to be a citizen of your own place also means that you have to be engaged. And also it's very important to understand in the context of the democracy that we talk about, it's not about choosing your leaders or your representatives, it's about making the decisions, engaging in solving the decisions, and figuring out what to do. When people do that, and a council member comes and tells them, this is the solution to a problem, the people have already worked through it. So the building of a local, the building of a TA is about the building of democracy, the construction of a people in the context of changing the environment, and the construction of power across the city. And that's why the Tenants Union is not just doing this in Boyle Heights, and that's why it was so crucial for us not to do this in Boyle Heights. We need to do this across the city to build a different kind of citizenship, a different kind of power that basically when the politicians come and tell you this is what you need, they tell you, fuck you, we already know what we're going to do, but we have to do it. We have to go through this stuff. And in the context of the United States, it is a long, protracted process, but we need to make a commitment to build a different kind of citizenship, a different kind of power, and a different kind of organization that creates a space where people take control of their community and start training to be the runners of their own city, the managers of their own city. I don't know if that answers.
That's great. That's great. I want to ask you both one more question with some awareness of the time, and then we're going to bring Khadijah into the conversation and then go into Q&A. But one question for you two in particular. I mean, Tracy, you kind of opened the talk with this conversation about Palestine, about the increasingly lethal escalation of the genocidal war across the region that is being spearheaded by Israel. And we're approaching the one-year anniversary of October 7th. I wanted to hear a bit about how tenant unions approach this challenge of anti-colonial solidarity with Palestine. We were just talking about how organizations are vehicles for new forms of power. What does that look like on the international terrain?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. I think that we're really charged to think about every place we are as a point of leverage that we can leverage for the sake of ending this war and ending this genocide. And I think especially thinking about the student movements advancing us into thinking about divestment. And so I'm going to name I'll give like two examples of how I see the role of the tenant union. And as of now, it is a modest one. And I think that we need to take seriously that so far all of our efforts have failed to stop the war. But that obviously is a call for us to think more strategically, smarter and harder about how we're going to move forward together. So in Los Angeles, I'll name these tenants who are organizing in buildings that were owned by K3. And K3 is the name of the three Khadijah brothers. And these landlords had, we have one of their tenants here tonight, actually.
Can K3 tenants raise their hands?
Yeah, I know. I'm like, wait, hi. So I'm going to talk a little bit about your building. So they had a business model, and that business model was evicting long-term rent-stabilized tenants, barely renovating the places and jacking up the rents. Especially this business model was targeting long-term Spanish speakers with disinformation about what their rights were, with violent threats, and like with these campaigns of repairs that were just really about making the buildings uninhabitable so that people would leave. And so this situation gave rise to the K3 Tenant Council, tenants from K3 buildings across the city organizing together to think about how they could beat back this extremely violent and aggressive landlord. They've been organizing for years. How many, Andrew? Before you got there and after you're gone. So now it's been 4. And interestingly enough, maybe not exactly surprisingly, one thing that we discovered this year after October is that the Kadishas have ties to Israeli real estate money. And not only that, the brothers hold fundraisers for the IDF. And not only that, one of the landlord himself, Michael Khadija, was present at UCLA as a part of the raid on the student encampment. And so the tenants, some of whom were already on rent strike, as a part of the organizing strategy to extract better conditions, livable conditions in their apartments. And so not only at that time was that organizing strategy affecting their housing, their communities. It was actually also withdrawing resources from the vast network of Israeli real estate and money that flows to the IDF. And that is one small example, but it was really mobilizing for tenants to commit to organizing their building and organizing across that tenant council. Not only was that organizing strategy a vision to benefit them, but it was also about accessing what leverage we have with our rents in the context of this genocide. I think maybe in the Q&A I'll talk more about divestment and real estate more broadly, but I think we've been going on, so
You guys have been doing great. If you also want to hear more, I think all 3 of the tenant unions that are tabling tonight, Ridgewood, Crown Heights Tenant Union, Brooklyn Eviction Defense Tenant Union, they have all, in their own ways, also been pursuing solidarity campaigns through the tenant movement. So go to their tables afterwards and ask them about that. So Khadija, I want to bring you in here. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, how you got involved in the tenant movement, and if you can tell us about a win in particular you've had in New York City you want to share.
So I came into the tenant movement around maybe 3.5 years ago when I was living in a basement apartment and my landlord had a carbon monoxide leak, and I had been getting really, really sick in the apartment up to a couple weeks prior. And one day I was getting up to work at my shitty job, which also didn't pay me enough to afford the rent in the first place. I couldn't move, my legs turned to jello. I had to crawl out of the basement apartment completely naked to get some air and call an ambulance. So I actually ended up calling a comrade from Flatbush Tenant Coalition, Fidel. Many of you know who she is. Shout out to Fidel.
Round of applause for Fidel.
Woo! Yeah, she actually pushed me to actually call Brooklyn Eviction Defense and help me with what was going on. And we actually ended up putting on a rally against this landlord, whom was a small landlord, but who I happen to also think small landlords can be particularly vicious because they only have one dwelling and they're just going to be hyper exploitative of you.
Yeah, that's right.
To bring notice to it, the daughter of the landlord was following me online. It was serious harassment, but yeah, I just came in because my family and I, we've always struggled with housing. I saw my dad try to avoid landlords. They call the police on us. So this is the grit, this is the struggle, this is where I come from. I'm from Brooklyn, from Flatbush, shout out to the 90s, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm from there, and I'm also a Trinidadian woman. So this is just the story of, you know, the Brooklyn, you know, East Flatbush life, you know, unfortunately.
Can you tell us a little bit about, well, yeah, round of applause. Khadijah, could you tell us a little bit about a win that you guys have had recently?
So recently, in July of this year, we have a tenant union member by the name of Sheila in Brooklyn Eviction Defense who's going through, it had been, we were organizing with Sheila ever since I joined BED. So it was a long haul struggling with that. And finally, it got to a point where we were like, okay, let's try to do something, because she had gotten the eviction papers and it was the whole thing. And we were also trying to get her arrears covered by ERAP. She was, I hope she doesn't mind, like it was a substantial amount, and they usually don't even cover that amount. So it was like struggling to get the ERAP and stop the eviction. So in July of this year, shout out to many of the people in the room who were there with me. We stopped the eviction from happening, and Sheila was able to stay in her home. And it was a big, big win for the union, and we've had other, you know, lots of wins in the unions that people here can speak to. But that was the most recent one, and it really, like, to see, you know, another sister just struggling, can't pay the landlord because the wages are low, and, you know, it's a systemic, you know, violence. It just, like, really uplifted us, everybody in the union.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. It's a great reminder that even when our stuff is working at the scale of individuals, it can be quite transformative in our lives to get some of these wins. I want to kick that question out to Leo and Tracy as well. Can you tell us about a win that you've experienced recently, and what does it trace about the future of the tenant movement?
You want to do 600K?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Oh.
We've got plenty of time.
Oh, okay. I mean, I could talk about the mariachi strike.
Love it.
Maybe. I think I maybe have notes. I love notes. I love knowing, like, that I won't get lost completely. But yeah, so yeah, I'll just talk about, you know, our book is called Abolish Rent, and one of the ways that we describe what that might be is a permanent and general rent strike. And so we want to pay specific attention to those moments where tenants are using that, like, central economic sanction that we have as our disposal, which is our rent checks, and the, like, central material that we have in our struggle, which is solidarity and each other. And so I'll just tell the story of the mariachis, who are really like an inspiration to us and to our ability to think about the rent strike as a tool that we could use and we could use to win with. And so this is a building of about 26 units, a block away from the historic Mariachi Plaza in the very gentrifying neighborhood of Boyle Heights, where the city had just you know, changed zoning laws, added transit, invested a lot of energy in a media project about the new Boyle Heights, and a new landlord bought their building, renamed it Mariachi Crossing, and proceeded to give all of the tenants eviction, like, rent increases, which were basically tantamount to eviction notices because they were up to $800 a month. And these tenants who live in not stabilized buildings realized that, like, well, this is legal, right? The market can, like, technically speaking, a landlord can charge whatever the market, not we, can bear. And over time, what the tenants decided to do was escalate their struggle to stay in their homes. And that meant organizing a tenant association in their building, and going on a year-long rent strike, withholding their rent, and partly because they couldn't pay, and half of them because they couldn't pay, and the other half because they wanted to stay in their homes with their neighbors, and they knew they would be next. And so I think that this story, what they were able to do with that strike was bring their landlord to the bargaining table to negotiate a bargaining agreement, a collective bargaining agreement that is the equivalent for rent stabilization in their building. So in so doing, they were able to change the governance of their building through their collective action. And I just want to note a few more things about this process, right? So like, I think as organizers, we often reflect on like, well, what is the thing that made this happen? How could this possibly have been done? And so when we talk to one of the tenants, Issa, we asked like, we know you signed this rent strike pact. Like, what was that like? Like, was that important? And she was like, I don't remember doing that. I remember being able, like, feeling comfortable enough to borrow an onion for my neighbor. And so I think that really tells us, like, what are we doing when we're organizing each other in our homes in these places that are so intimate and that really produce our our ability to connect with each other. And then another thing that I would say is like something the landlord reflected on that I think our movement should hear is that when the tenants showed up at his door, that was a moment where that was a pretty important moment for his decision to show up to the negotiating table, right? So what are the other forms of direct action that we can use alongside our strike, like reputational damage, the kind of raising the social cost of showing up at the site of someone's home? I mean, in the movement, we often say like, eviction displacement is personal for us. It should be personal for our landlords too. And then finally, right, just this sense that, when we talk to tenants on rent strike, and I experience this myself in my own building because I have now just passed my second year of being on rent strike. All right. Thank you. My tenant association was supposed to be here, but as Leo saw, they were like trying to change our keys and like the people were being anyway, long story. But
nice up locating their building.
yeah, no, we don't need that. They're fine. Not yet. I'll call you. But I promise to. But what tenants experience is a new form of collective ownership over the places that they live. Even at this moment, right, where you're so vulnerable because you stopped paying rent, you stopped like the monthly ritual, this contract that you're supposed to turn over. Like at that moment where you become incredibly vulnerable, suddenly people's experience is that they have more ownership over their housing that they've ever had before, right? They're taking on like repairing their buildings. They're like recognizing their right to their homes. And so I think that really tells us like, about the horizon of our struggle. And when we think about rent abolition and what we're naming in terms of new relationships to each other and to the places where we live.
One of the cool things of writing these stories or telling them in a place like this is that there's so many dimensions to what's happening here. And I think that's what's important to understand about Tenants Union. It's not just about tenants and the relationship to the landlord, it's about the construction of territory. And as we build territory, it's about the construction of a space so when we have a war, we have a territory to defend. And when we have a war, we have an authority and all this thing that is being built. And this is connected to one of the stories that I wanted to share in a tangential way, but it's important to understand we're trying to build territory. So we can control territory, so we can fight for territory and protect those who are inside that territory. And in our context, so there is this apartment that we've been organizing for a long, long time, and that they have a committee, and they're always doing this stuff. And all of a sudden, there's this new building that are appearing right now in our neighborhood. There are sort of like Airbnb buildings, but when you look inside these buildings, it's like in this context, we're talking about 3 units in one terreno, in one piece of land, that have about 8 bedrooms, 1 kitchen, and 2 bathrooms. In every one of those bedrooms, there is a family, father, mother, and children. Now, multiply that times 3 properties with this same kind of territory. in this community, right next to this building that we've been organizing for a long, long time, and there was this huge problem, a lot of these were new immigrants, Colombians, and they were like being very rowdy, and they were having parties, and the neighbors kept complaining to us, and we're like, well, guys, we need to develop relationships, don't complain. None of these cabrones, they're like making all this noise, and we're like going on and trying to talk about building relationships. And anyway, so those things get solved over time. One day we get a call from the leader from that building and says, hey, in the building next door that we always complain about, the woman, they just kicked her out of her apartment, and that they put her on the street, and they threw all the stuff on her trash, and the other stuff they locked her in. What can we do? And say, well, go help her. So we call all the neighbors, and we start coming down the street to go to them, and we did like basically it was an illegal eviction. So immediately we go in there with the community, we break the padlocks in the garage, we take all their stuff, put it back in the apartment, find the stuff in the trash we collected. The woman is crying and no concern. But it doesn't end there. When we started talking to the tenants there, the party troublemakers, they start telling us all the stuff that's happening in the building. The women are being sexually harassed by the manager. The manager is changing the rents every week on them. If they're late one day, the rent goes up. If something happens, the guy is really messing with them like terribly. And they were afraid because they didn't know what was going on. They're recently arrived and they're terrified. But as we start talking to them, the woman who's complaining says, we have to support them. We have to help them. And we're like, okay, fine, And as we start working with them in the building, we start realizing that there's all these properties also in South Central. So we're talking about 60 families on the same situation. 60 families. And they're living one bedroom per family, sharing the kitchen and stuff like that. So they decided to go on a rent strike. As they start, and the group of this building, they start organizing meetings in the other buildings. The manager comes one day to try to kick them out, and what do you call it, the thing that sprays you with the police on the eyes? Pepper spray. So he maces one of the leaders, and big battle starts happening, and the police comes, and we're all there organizing, and basically the police, after they hear the story, arrest the manager and take him with them. So the tenants get emboldened and say, well, by the way, there's more problems in our building. So that's why we have now 60 families in 3 properties organizing, and they're going on a rent strike. And it's like a couple of months that we're trying to organize this rent strike, and the landlord starts coming and trying to negotiate and yells at the top of his lungs because he didn't want to take responsibility for what the manager is doing. And they decide to go on a rent strike. And after a while, I start talking to them and say, well, guys, now it's time to start sitting down and negotiate some things. And the guy said, fuck it, we want to go until he fixes everything in our building and does everything. And goes on and on and on and on, a whole year. And I'm freaking out because there's a conventional common sense that we all have about how organizing has to happen, but the tenants don't have it. And the organizers who are there, who's younger than me, my son, by the way, they said, yeah, fuck you don't know what you're doing. The tenants are ready to fight, we're going to fight. A whole year goes, $500,000 later, the tenants end up negotiating with the landlord, and they get their rent forgiven. Basically, everything they don't pay gets forgiven. The manager stayed in jail. The repairs are happening, and the woman who got kicked out now is the manager of the 3 properties. So, control of territory, building relationships, building power, and having the organization that is willing to do what the tenants say. Not what the organizer says, not what the lawyer says, not what the nonprofit professional says, not what the foundation is paid you to do. The tenants make the decisions, the tenants take the risk, the tenants take it to another level. And in that process, we build the territory for the people who are ready to fight for it.
I want to ask one quick question. This is a lightning round, and then we're going to kick it out to Q&A. I want to get your sense of what the biggest challenge we face as the movement is. What's the most pressing strategic task for us? What needs to be done, not tomorrow, but right now? So if you want to invite us all to one big signal thread, this is the time to do so.
I always say that definitely building actual relationships with the communities, because I think that, and shout out to my comrade who's not here right now, Patrick. A lot of people, they'll say, oh, I want to organize, I want to come into this Black community and organize all these Black people. And, it's just, first of all, it's infantilizing. You just can't come into a community and just, say that you want to, kind of offer some sort of philanthropic kind of, help or something like that. You really have to sow roots in the community. And I also think there needs to be some level of self-interrogation. Why are you organizing? And also, if you're coming into a community that is primarily poor, black and brown, are you really grappling with the fact that you yourself are also contributing to the dispossession of these people? And I think a lot of times those things are not addressed. So for me, I want to see more union within like the different tenant organizations. I think that that's central to build power, to actually build militancy. And I think that moving people beyond just tenant consciousness is really imperative, because you can, we can fight for reforms and things, and that's very, very necessary. Everybody needs to get a new stove. I just got a new fridge. And I had to be on them about that, but at the same time, it's like we need to be kind of developing the kind of seedbed of political consciousness that moves people beyond just, I need a new stove, to I need a new fucking system, right?
Yes.
So that's it.
That's great.
I mean, I'll just name a challenge, right? Which is that, that comes from me. My landlord is U.S. Bank. It's the bank owns the building because long story, they got it back at the auction after we sabotaged it because they said that the person who bought it paid too little. That bank, to that bank, our rents are jack shit. And this is one of the reasons that we've managed to be on rent strike for 2 years. And as our landlords consolidate and as real estate turns into REITs and is owned not by individuals but by corporations and by asset managers that mean that people own a fraction of whatever that building is, right? Those accountability structures that we make, that we rely on in our organizing, like to do the kind of, to make it personal, that becomes a lot more challenging. And so I think for me, right, I think obviously the being on rent strike is a big deal to me, right? But it's not necessarily a big deal to my landlord who is waiting us out. But in the meantime, and that's just to say, I think that one of our biggest challenges is about these new forms of ownership, and that takes us reflecting on how we are going to deal with these with even less accountability that there exists, that there are all these forms, from LLCs to asset management structures that keep the owners of our home immune from our work. And I think that what that takes is, as Khadijah was saying, is a bigger movement. It's certainly more of us. And that, I think, is something that I struggle with, as these forms claim more and more of the places where we can live.
You said briefly, huh?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, two things. When the pandemic started, tenants could not pay their rent. Tenants could not afford to pay the rent. And there were two ways of looking at it. One of them is I say, poor tenants cannot pay their rent, what are we gonna do? Or for the tenants to say, fuck you, we're not gonna pay rent, and food, not rent. And that's what happened in Los Angeles and then across the country. And that's what forced the government to do what they needed to do. So that's one example. Another example is also during the pandemic, homeless people in Los Angeles, a community of homeless decided to go occupy a park, build showers, bolsa de trabajo. I'm sorry, I'm thinking Spanish a lot today. A place where they could find jobs for each other, a harm reduction place. They started growing food inside the place, and they created their own security system. The council members were crazy because they had dared to take over the park and turn it into something. And they couldn't do anything because there was a pandemic. And in that process, they built a community. If you had asked the nonprofits and organizations and affordable housing developers what to do in that context, they wouldn't know what the fuck to do. But the on-house people knew what to do. So I think that our challenge is to get out of our own common sense. All of us here, all of us in this kind of process, we have our common sense of how to do politics in the United States, how to do politics in our communities. But really, it's all about allowing and creating the space for the people to organize themselves and to push forward in those struggles. The fight of the homeless in Echo Park tells us where we have to go. We have to take control of our territory, transform that territory, and create it in such a way that we can take care of each other and take care of each other's needs. Of course, the state is going to come after us. So then we have to build the defense. And we have to build the mechanisms. But you can only do that by taking over territory, constructing territory. We have to form the organizations that make that possible. We have to form the organizations that defend, that hold people themselves, and that help people build what is needed to be done in this country. That's the only thing that we can do. But first, we have to get rid of our common sense, and start listening to the struggles and the places where struggle is happening. And the pandemic can show us lots of places where that could happen.
Thanks so much. Fantastic. We have time for a few questions for Q&A. Keep in mind that we are live streaming this event. The cameras cannot see you. They can only see me. So when my next landlord Googles me, he'll see Abolish Rent behind me. But your questions will be audible, so keep that in mind. Robert, comrade here, is going to hand the mic off to a couple of people. Let's see some hands. Who would like to ask a question? We're keeping it to questions now. Comments, denunciations, polemics can be taken to your newsletter or Twitter later. But we see 3 comrades in a row right here. Maybe we can start with, and then we can go to the comrade in orange on the right afterwards, Robert, and maybe we can just see if we have time for more questions after that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Hunter Boone. I actually was talking to you, Tracy, over Twitter the other night. I just formed a tenant association, and I'm actually meeting a comrade tonight. We shared the same landlord, and they also have a tenant association. They won recently. But the goal is that we actually want to expand the tenant union. So what's the guidance and the steps to expand a tenant union across buildings?
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna ask a few questions and then we'll go take them in a group.
So I am originally we from Brooklyn, same thing as you are. We both immigrating from the Caribbean as well. So. But also another thing, we had to abolish so-called tax lien sales, whoever owned these properties, because of every tenant who lived there, they didn't return home because some corporation did a lien on it. So and the second thing, how do we stop illegal conversions from coming through? For if your own apartment or your own home like that. So what are both sides? What are the both sides to how do we abolish it?
Thanks, comrade.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really good. I'm really excited about this book, and it was a super energizing, inspiring talk. And you guys rock. You're, big fan. So my question is how did you take the time to write the book? A huge challenge of organizing for me is writing while thinking while doing it and taking time to reflect. It's so on the go, next thing. How did you take the time to step back and write it? I'm really excited about this book, and I think it's going to inspire a lot of people to organize. So thank you.
That's a great question. And we had one more question over here, comrade in orange.
My question is about fear, and if you could talk to how tenants feel fear, and what are ways that when you are organizing, you can account for that fear and address that fear.
So we've got portfolio organizing, fear, how to abolish, and how do you write?
Do you want to start? You do the union one. I'll do maybe just the first thing that I would say. The comrade here, I understood your question to be also about lien sales, right? People who own their housing, but they're in precarious situations because maybe they've taken out debt. And I think that, we have talked a lot too about the ways that homeownership, it divides the working class, right? That like part of this long-term project of recruiting people into alignment with the right has to do with offering them the promise of the asset, the private asset that you get, that you control all on your own, and the kinds of politics that flow from owning that tiny box. However, right, what we saw in the financial crisis is that so many people don't actually control those homes that they own, right? The bank does. For a lot of people who are underwater with debt or at risk of predation in terms of like these like liens that people can put on your house and take advantage of you, right? And so I think that there is, I think that the issue of debt is one that really makes an allegiance between bank tenants, right? Which I'm calling people who don't own their home outright. The landlord, their landlord in some ways is a bank. And so I think that there are there are roots to solidarity to be made there, absolutely. To the comrade who asked about fear, I think that's like a beautiful question, and it's something that I spend so much time thinking about, right? Because, I think when you talk to people, like the idea of something, like the idea both of losing their housing is so terrifying because of all those things that I named earlier, right? Like the risk of violence and the extremity of being displaced. And also the fear that that is one huge source of fear. And then another comes from taking any kind of political risk, right? It can be terrifying to jeopardize the roof that you have over your head. And it can be, it's like we've talked to people who've said basically I'm afraid the roof is gonna collapse the night that I withhold rent for the first time, right? That is how intense these feelings are. And I think that there's many ways that we can address people's fear. I think the two central ones are accurate information and each other. And maybe three is a way of acknowledging something else that is always happening, while we're afraid, which is also that we're really fucking angry. And so for the first two, right, I think accurate information is really sometimes the best that we got to say here are things that we know that you're entitled to in an eviction process. Even just the idea that you won't be thrown out of your home the next day is actually so important to bringing down how someone is experiencing that moment, right? So what is the accurate information that we can provide people to diffuse some of that sense of fear? And then what is the how can we support people in taking risks, right? And that sense that the thing that I named about borrowing an onion just comes back to me over and over and over again, because it is really that distribution of risk, right? That was called for in that sense of saying that if one of us doesn't pay rent right now, then that person is at a huge risk. But if we all do it, it's shared, right? And how did they build that community? Well, they they met every week, right? It's consistency. They met every Tuesday night. They ate a lot of food. They had the support of the entire union there at their events. So I think that it's I think we really need to take seriously that the antidote to our fear is each other. And then I would say too, I've gone on. I've gone on, but I want to also name that we also experience, well, maybe two things, right? That not doing, like not intervening in your housing situation, like not organizing with your neighbors, right? Like that's also a risk. That's also terrifying. The way that we live now is terrifying. Like landlords that have this incredible power over our human needs that like we don't have, that like that system is terrifying. And we are at risk by living in the system that we're in right now. So I think that when we judge, you know, like when we take a look at the risks that we're experiencing, I think that it can be really powerful for people to look at that. I'll let you answer some.
Yeah, I can just say a couple words real quick. I think I could answer to your question about the illegal conversions. I mean, we need to stop incentivizing landlords to, whether they be small, to make these like little illegal apartments that end up killing people, because HPD is not doing anything. They need to go. And we need to kind of band together to really fight against this, not on legislatively, whatever wins we can get there, but we also need to kind of like really come down hard on these people, because these illegal conversions are killing people. And I would also say to your question also, this idea of, you know, the homeowner and things, I think we just need to uproot the whole concept of the homeowner, because actually, like you said, you don't actually even own anything. I mean, unless you want to wait till 30, 40 years, okay? But like, you don't actually even own anything. And this particular class is kind of the bourgeois class, petty bourgeois class. They have these like aspirational modes of thinking where they think that, you know, I'm a homeowner, and I actually was talking about this, I'm a homeowner, I'm, you know, somehow moving up into the higher echelons of like socioeconomic security and things like that, but they're actually closer to working class people. But they have all these like, you know, distortions rolling around in their minds. But I think, like you were just undoing that kind of concept, working to undo it, because it's gonna take some time, and just really forming a movement that can kind of like grapple hard with like people who are, you know, dying because of these illegal conversions. And to my homegirl over there, what's up, girl? Danny. I would just say that, you know, for a long time, I was very, very fearful to do anything. I was living in that basement for like 4 years, and I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. She was mean. I mean, this lady was wretched. I mean, she was horrific. She was mean. She was nasty. And my family actually lived like next door. And, you know, but that also speaks to the sense of community that was not there. So she felt like she could do whatever she wanted. And I was also like, I think the only person paying rent during the pandemic, you know, because I just got tired of it, you know. I mean, the carbon monoxide thing was the last straw. And after that, when I got better, I actually was like, bitch, fuck you. You fuck your shit, fuck your shitty house, fuck your whatever, bitch, go, get the fuck out of here, bitch. Like, and I was only able to do that because of, you know, I met Fidel, I met Flatbush Tenant Coalition, I met, you know, Brooklyn Eviction Defense, and I felt like they really had my back with this, and I couldn't have done it without them to kind of release that fear. But also just for the immigrant community, there is a lot of fear. And if people just have, you know, yeah, the onion, let me borrow some sugar, let me borrow some curry, let me, you know, something, so they don't feel completely like thrown to the wayside.
One of the tensions that we had within the book, and probably I'm going to try to answer the 3 questions at the same time, we'll see. One of the tensions we had within the book was the whole notion of, is the book a training manual for tenants to organize themselves? Or is it a book for organizers so they start building a tenants union? And this has to do with fear in a sense. The whole idea that tenants themselves just going to organize in the context of fear is kind of difficult. We need to have the organization where tenants feel the power to make those things, because in the fear itself is also the thing that we don't want, right? When you're afraid of not paying the rent, you're at the same time saying, fuck it, I don't want to pay rent. My apartment is in bad shape, and why am I paying rent? And this building has been paid for a long, long time, but I don't want to pay rent. But there has to be an organization and a space where people are able to say, fuck it, I'm not going to pay rent. So the fear has to do also with the relationship with the organization, the relationship you have with each other's community, but the organization that is self-consciously is building the space for people to enact the thing that was going to remove the thing that they're afraid of. Did that make sense? Yeah. And that's very, very important. That goes to the construction of the organization. Again, we have a common sense of what the organization has to be like. Look at the political world that we live in the United States. The whole country is falling to pieces. And we have the worst candidates I don't think we ever had good candidates, but we're in a really shitty situation, right? And we're still playing our games. We need to lose the fear. So in this context, we have to also break away from our own fear of the organization that we have to build. The Tenants Union was built by people who were not afraid because they had never been organizers, because they had never been paid by a non-profit, because they were not part of a foundation. A bunch of them, they had never been in a Marxist-Leninist group or anything like that. These were people who wanted to do something in their neighborhood because what they have learned in the neighborhood. So they didn't have that common sense that comes from everything that a lot of us have. They were ready to take a risk. They were ready to do this stuff. So when we're talking about growing the Tenants Union, what do you have to do? Grow the Tenants Union. You know, and the way we've done it in Los Angeles is we form locals. We form spaces within the neighborhood. In some neighborhoods, it blows up in our face. In our neighborhoods, it grows. It's a big-ass experiment that has only 10 years? Has only like 10 years. When you look at the context of what we're trying to do in this country, it's just the beginning. So I think we need to lose the fear and look at every step as an experiment. And when it blows up, take a step back in the organization and discuss it. Do it collectively. Our organizers don't work by themselves. They're all volunteers. They're all doing the big experiment of building their TA or building their association or building the local. And then we'll get together, and sometimes we fight about who's right and who's wrong. And you know, the criterion of truth is practice. So we start seeing the things that emerge that make things happen. We need to lose our fear. So tenants as a class, as a community, also lose their fear with the organization. And in writing the book, that's the same thing. You know, you have to get a friend that yells at you and gets you to write the book and do the things they have to do because you're afraid of putting your ideas in paper and yell at each other and challenge each other. And yes, it's difficult. And I must be honest. I mean, Tracy took a big brunt in terms of making sure that this would happen. And I need help, but we had to get rid of our fear, put our ideas on paper, and then be challenged by us. I mean, there are things that now I read and say, oh, you know, maybe we need to rethink this thing. But if we don't do it, we're not able to look at it and say, well, there is more to think about this stuff. So, and the time, yeah, I mean, it's a struggle, it's a pain in the ass, but at some point you're like building the organization. The book was also a tool to start having this conversation. For me to be in Los Angeles, in New York, in other places, to do stuff, for Tracy to decide to say, fuck it, I'm going to New York, and do this, and do these things. So we just have to do these things. And just like we're asking the tenants to lose their fear, and I'm speaking as an organizer, just like we ask the tenants to lose their fear, we need to lose our fear. Just like we ask the tenants to finish at the end of work after doing all their stuff and we with their family feeding each other, and we have to also, at the end of work, we have to go there, go to the meeting and figure it out. We have to lose our fear.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. We just conferred. There's the comrade in pink here will be number one, and I want to go the comrade in white up front. Is your shirt pink? Natalia.
Pink enough. First off, I want to shout out Flatbush and shout out Trini. And my question is, are there any current or historical tenant struggles that you recommend comrades learn more about that you feel are under-amplified or that you'd like to shed light on that aren't covered in the book?
Great, thank you. Then we have Natalia.
What was it? Who else?
Thank you so much, comrades. This was a really incredible talk. You know, from an organizing point of view, I wanted to ask about like the unique challenges in overcoming divisions within tenants and within buildings, like divisions between, long-standing community divisions and racial divisions, the tendency under capitalism that we have to blame each other for our own problems rather than the system, and how that can really be an obstacle to organizing, and how, you comrades have managed to overcome that.
Really great questions. Khadijah, do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned it in the book, but I think more people should learn about the tenant organizing that was going on in Harlem that Claudia Jones was doing, and the African Blood Brotherhood with Cyril Briggs and Harry Haywood, who came in later, Otis Hyde, Claude McKay, Queen Mother Moore. Shout out to the ancestors. I feel like people need to know more about that, because that laid the foundation for the formation of parties, First Communist Party, and it laid the foundation for so much. Claudia Jones actually lived in Harlem and actually almost died from a lung infection that she got from the mold in the apartment that she was in. And she started organizing around the Scottsboro Boys case, and then she also started organizing around tenants in Harlem where she used to live. So people need to know about that, especially she was also a Trinidadian woman. And, people, I find even when they talk about her as some sort of footnote in passing, but they definitely don't even talk about her tenant organizing, and they definitely don't talk about African Brotherhood, which I think is central to not only the American communist movement, but a global international communist movement, if you're into that sort of thing. But I think, so right now we're organizing with some people in Brownsville, shout out to Brownsville, where I am. And there is mad problems with this building. This one, they don't like each other. This one have a problem. And everybody has a problem with something, and it's difficult every meeting and stuff like that. But I think like what we are trying to do, what we try to do, because we've been trying to organize with this building for about like 2.5 years-ish, 2 years, is that, just trying to throw like little tenant parties. We had like a little tenant gathering. People would cook some like kind of chicken, some food, and just talk to each other. And they're getting to the point now where it's like, no, let's forget about these divisions and let's forget about these things and let's try to, come together. As far as like the racial divisions, I really do think that this needs to be grappled with in an honest way. And the only way that it can, honestly be grappled with is through, I think, a process of like criticism, self-criticism. Like, again, why are you organizing? Why are you here in this particular community? And do you know the people? Do you know the history, the culture? Sometimes I see like, there's brothers on the corner, rolling dice, doing whatever, and some of the white people would just pass these people right by. Like they don't even matter. Like they're like vermin or something. Like talk to the people in the neighborhood. Talk to the brothers. And also, like I pointed this out in my own union, I'm like, listen, we need more black people. And I don't really even see a lot of black men in the tenant union. Where are the black men? You know what I'm saying? We need everybody in the entire community. If we're talking about liberation, we're talking about a people, we need to encompass everybody. We just can't leave out whole groups of people who are historically hunted and gutted peoples. So I just think that we just need to have an encompassing and an honest idea of unity that speaks to what is keeping us disunified in the first place.
Yeah.
Then I have to end, which is too much pressure. You go ahead.
On the tension in community, one of my favorite phrases is that we have to act our way into thinking, not thinking our way into acting. And what does that mean? Is that, you don't start by telling people, oh, you should all be friends with each other. You have to have the activities and the work and the process that brings people together. When we think about the construction of social, political, ideological organization, we need to still start with the social process itself of constructing community. Coming from the liberation theology perspective, when we started in the housing project, it was called Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, church-based communities. And the emphasis was on the word community because there's a huge difference between a community and a committee. A committee has tasks and obligations and responsibilities. But the construction of community is a social process of people coming together on the barbecue, on putting together the meeting. So when we organize our meetings in the neighborhood, we ask everybody to put together the meeting. Someone puts the house, someone puts the chairs, someone puts the food. This thing is bouncing something. So the construction of the space where the communities happen is the work of everybody. And in working together, people learn to collaborate with each other and also learn to hate each other. But over time, the practice creates the discipline where people learn that they're about something else that goes beyond that. And on the practice, they learn that they're about building the organization that goes beyond their individual cases. And that goes across languages. In the Tenants Union, we're a multilingual organization, and took us a while to come to a place where everybody could speak in their own language without feeling segregated or discriminated against. We put an emphasis, but little by little. So acting our way into thinking is when we go out into the neighborhood to clean up the alley, everybody's part of it. And somebody will clean more than others and will resent that, but over time, everybody's cleaning the alley. And over time, everybody knows that everybody is necessary. It takes time. And I think a lot of times we let the conflict take over us and our own fear, and that goes to the organizers. Well, we're the ones who are afraid. But the tenants are still working together, still cleaning the alley. We saw the example that I gave on the Colombians and the neighbors there, When they saw that this woman was being pushed out, on the house that everybody was having parties, they understood that they needed to bring her back home. And that then opened up the space to have the other conversation. So we also have to give time to the construction of that relationship. So then later on, you build the unity and the language for people to address their problems. No community is perfect. No organization is perfect. We will have conflicts no matter what. We will have tensions, but we have to be able to have the organization that is able to deal with that and that brings people forward to the next step. And we just need to understand the imperfection of this process. Community and social processes are imperfect. We will have conflict, but we need to have the organization that is able to carry forward in the middle of the conflict.
Okay, I'll just be really brief and answer your question, which is, one of someone that we organized with in the Los Angeles Tenant Union is doing amazing research on the National Union of the Homeless. And I think that this organization that was supported by communist organizing, very important, and that the role of the Communist Party in forming that organization is not really reported on, and she's doing amazing work to bring that up. And I think that it also, as Leo was talking about in the context of Echo Park, I think that one of the reasons why their struggle is really at the end of our book is that both because our politics are around organizing for and with the most vulnerable people, and that kind of transformation that we need in order to support the most vulnerable people really tells us what the vanguard of our struggle is. And that struggle in Echo Park, the claiming of land, the recirculating of resources, the building of a community system of defense around that place that was claimed, that occupation, right? That really shows us where we need to go as a movement. And so I'll just end with, the National Union of the Homeless had this really beautiful slogan that I think about all the time, which is you only get what you're organized to take. And that.
Well, if you wanted to make...
Yeah, I just wanted to, so we're gonna close out, but I wanted to mention two things. 200 years since Engels wrote The Housing Question, and the shit is still relevant. The shit is still relevant today. It is really, really crazy. And I just wanted to talk about my partner and I's own experience in looking for a home, which we found, thank God, was that, all of these things, all these brokers' fees and all of these credit scores, these are all really kind of eugenicist tactics, because you're saying that if you don't have the right credit score, you're gonna end up homeless and you're gonna fucking die. Mm-hmm. And I think we really need to work to uproot the kind of vulturistic, capitalistic tendencies that seeps into the communities that keep people unhoused and dispossessed. And I just also wanted to talk one moment about the displacement prevention program that with Met Council that kind of helped me get the funds to get my new apartment. So over at the table at Brooklyn Eviction Defense, you can kind of learn more about that.
This was a great conversation. One of my favorite things about the tenant movement is if you get 3 tenant organizers in a room talking for a little over an hour, they will start talking about communism. And we totally adhered to that rule today. Please buy the book, talk to your neighbor, fight your landlord. Thank you, Khadijah. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Leo. Great job. Really good.
No, thank you guys.
People were engaged. They were locked in. I know, it's crazy.